Before we begin our journey into the world of Henry VIII and his 6 wives, I'd like to invite you to relax, get comfortable, and drift into this story at your own pace. If you enjoy calm, soothing history told as a bedtime story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps us share more peaceful stories from the past, and it means you'll always have something steady and comforting to fall asleep to. Now, let's step back into Tudor England, where a young prince was about to change history forever. In the late 1400s, England was still trying to catch its breath after years of family feuds known as the Wars of the Roses. Out of this messy tangle of crowns, cousins, and betrayals came Henry Tudor, later Henry VII, who put the Tudor family on the throne. His second son, a red-haired boy named Henry, wasn't expected to be king. That job was meant for his older brother Arthur. So little Henry grew up with a curious freedom. He was trained in books, music, and religion instead of politics and warfare. He had tutors drilling him in Latin and theology, but he also had the sort of energy that made him love sports, hunting, and basically anything that let him show off. Even as a boy, Henry was a mix of church choir boy and rowdy teammate. No one knew it then, but this cheerful second son would one day become one of the most famous kings in history. Henry's childhood was filled with luxury, but not the over-the-top kind he would later demand as king. His father, Henry VII, was cautious with money. He'd fought hard for the throne, so he treated it like fragile glass: protect it, keep it safe, don't spend too much on shiny things. But little Henry had a taste for shiny things already. He loved rich fabrics, musical instruments, and anything that felt royal. He practiced the lute, danced with the court ladies, and sang in a voice that people said was quite good. If TikTok had existed, Henry would have been the kid posting duet covers and showing off his jousting form in short clips. Yet underneath all that charm, there was a streak of stubbornness. He liked to win, and when he didn't, he sulked. In other words, he was already acting like a king in training without realizing it. Henry's education was top-notch. Unlike many nobles of the time who were just taught how to fight and sign their name, Henry had the full royal package: Latin, Greek, theology, philosophy, astronomy, and even mathematics. His tutors often bragged that he could debate like a scholar while still running faster than the boys around him. Imagine a kid who was both captain of the football team and top of the debate club. Yeah, that was young Henry. He loved being praised for his brains just as much as his brawn. People at court started whispering that he was too good to be wasted as the spare prince. But no one dared say it too loudly, because Prince Arthur, the serious, responsible heir, was still around, and Henry's path to greatness was supposed to stop at the church door. His destiny, maybe to be a powerful cardinal, not a king. If you asked young Henry what he liked best about life, it probably wouldn't have been books. He loved action, hunting, jousting, wrestling, anything that let him move and compete. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and quick, even as a teenager. People said he could ride a horse with such grace that he seemed born in the saddle. He'd disappear into the royal forests chasing deer with a bow, or charge across open fields with a lance tucked under his arm, practicing for tournaments. Sport was not just play for him, it was a way to show power, skill, and a bit of flair. And Henry always liked flair. He wanted people to look at him and say, "There goes someone special." Spoiler alert, they did, but destiny doesn't always follow the plan. Henry's older brother, Prince Arthur, was the quiet one, more studious and thoughtful. He was married young to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess, in a grand alliance meant to tie England and Spain together. Everyone assumed Arthur would take the throne, rule wisely, and carry on the Tudor line, but Arthur grew sickly. He was delicate where Henry was robust, reserved where Henry was bold. And then suddenly, he died at just 15. The Tudor court was shocked. The crown now rested on the head of Henry, the boy no one had been raising to be king. One day he was the fun spare, and the next, he was England's only hope for the future. It was like being thrown from the choir straight onto center stage, with the whole kingdom watching. Overnight, his life of music, games, and books became something heavier. He was the heir now. Suddenly, every move mattered, every decision was watched. His father became even more protective, worried about keeping the Tudor crown safe after years of civil war. Henry was shielded from risks, surrounded by guards, and given endless lessons on statecraft. For a boy who loved freedom, it must have felt like being caged. Still, he embraced it with the same energy he gave to sports. If he was going to be king, he was going to be the best king anyone had ever seen. And honestly, young Henry probably believed it. England itself was still fragile. The Wars of the Roses had ended not long before, but old grudges ran deep. Rival families lurked in the background, waiting for Tudor weakness. Henry VII ruled with caution, using spies, marriages, and taxes to keep everyone in line. This meant Henry VIII grew up in a world where loyalty was never guaranteed, and treason was just a whisper away. He saw his father's paranoia firsthand. It shaped him in ways he probably didn't realize. Later in life, Henry VIII would become obsessed with loyalty, quick to punish betrayal, and never shy about removing threats permanently. That seed was planted in his childhood, in a court that wore smiles but hid daggers. But it wasn't all gloom and paranoia. Court life had a sparkle, and Henry thrived in it. He loved dancing, feasts, and showing off his skills to whoever was watching. He was the kind of person who walked into a room and everyone noticed. His bright red hair, athletic build, and booming laugh made him impossible to ignore. He had charisma, the kind of charm that made people forgive his flaws, at least for a while. Even as a teenager, Henry carried himself like someone born to rule. Some of it was natural, some of it was practiced, but all of it worked. He was the golden boy of the Tudor court, and he knew it. Still, behind the golden image, there were hints of the king he would become. Henry loved control, he liked winning, he liked attention, and he did not like being told no. His tutors and attendants learned quickly that it was better to encourage him than oppose him. As king, that side of his personality would grow larger and darker. But at this stage, it came across as boyish stubbornness. He was clever, confident, and restless. He wanted to be everything at once: scholar, warrior, lover, ruler, and in time he would be all those things, but not without breaking a lot along the way. So, the stage was set. A boy who was never meant to rule suddenly found himself heir to the throne of England. He had the brains, the charm, the muscle, and the ambition. What he didn't yet have was the experience or the realization that kingship was far heavier than a jousting lance. The England he would inherit was nervous, hopeful, and suspicious all at once. Henry didn't know it yet, but his reign would become one of the most dramatic in English history. 6 wives, a brand new church, and a legacy that still fascinates the world. But in these early years, he was just a boy stepping into shoes far bigger than his own, humming a tune on his lute, dreaming of glory. Before Catherine of Aragon ever set foot in England, she was already famous in Europe. Born in 1485, she was the youngest daughter of 2 of the most powerful monarchs in the world, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. Yes, the same Isabella and Ferdinand, who sponsored Columbus when he sailed west. Catherine grew up in a Spain full of castles, Catholic devotion and political ambition. Her childhood was far from ordinary. She was educated to be a queen, trained in languages, religion, household management, and diplomacy. By the time she was a teenager, she was fluent in Latin and had learned how to smile politely while keeping her true thoughts tucked away. She was raised with one purpose: to marry well, and in doing so strengthen Spain's influence across Europe. And England was first on the list. England's Tudor dynasty was brand new when Catherine was betrothed to Prince Arthur, Henry's older brother. Henry VII was eager to lock down alliances that made his shaky crown look sturdier, and Spain, flush with wealth and prestige, was a prize partner. So the plan was simple. Catherine marries Arthur. Their children join English and Spanish blood, and everyone lives happily ever after. Except, of course, life rarely follows the script. When Catherine arrived in England in 1501, she was greeted with pomp and parades. She must have looked like the perfect princess, red hair like the Tudors, graceful manner like her mother, and a devout piety that matched the mood of Catholic Europe. For Arthur, though, this wasn't just politics. This was his wife. Unfortunately, he didn't get to enjoy marriage for long. Arthur and Catherine's marriage barely had time to start before tragedy struck. Only months after the wedding, Arthur fell ill with what people called the sweating sickness, and he died. Catherine was only 16, a widow in a foreign land, her future suddenly uncertain. For Henry VII, this was a political nightmare. Spain had sent a princess, and now she had no husband. To send her back would risk losing the alliance. To keep her in England, they'd need a new plan. That plan ended up involving young Henry, Arthur's little brother. At first, nothing was decided. Catherine lingered in limbo, living in gloomy castles, her dowry half paid, her future dangling. It wasn't exactly the fairy tale ending she'd been promised. Catherine stayed in England for years after Arthur's death, stuck in a kind of royal waiting room. Her father and Henry VII haggled endlessly over money. Half her dowry had been paid, but not the other half. Imagine being a teenage widow treated like a chess piece, while 2 kings argue about expenses. She lived modestly, not quite queen, not quite guest, almost forgotten at court. But Catherine wasn't the type to sulk forever. She leaned on her faith, prayed daily, and showed patience that would become her trademark. People admired her quiet dignity, though she probably felt lonely, stranded far from sunny Spain in damp English castles. Then came Henry. By the time he was a teenager, Henry was tall, athletic, and full of charm. Catherine was 5 years older, but age didn't matter much in royal circles. Henry VII realized the solution: marry Catherine to Prince Henry instead, keeping the Spanish alliance alive. But there was a complication. According to church law, marrying your brother's widow was forbidden. Luckily, the Pope could hand out special permissions, and with a bit of persuasion he did. Catherine and Henry were officially betrothed. Catherine, after years of waiting, had a path to becoming queen again. And Henry, well, he was still a teenager, more interested in hunting than marriage contracts. Still, their union was set in stone. When Henry VII died in 1509, his son, now King Henry VIII, wasted no time. At just 17 years old, Henry married Catherine, and together they became the new golden couple of England. The coronation was a dazzling affair, with tapestries, music, and feasting. People saw them as a match made in heaven, the handsome, energetic young king, and the graceful, pious queen. For Catherine, it was the fresh start she had been waiting for. For Henry, it was the beginning of his reign, filled with dreams of glory and adventure. Nobody at that moment could imagine how turbulent their marriage would become, or how it would reshape England forever. At first, their marriage was happy. Henry adored Catherine, and she brought stability and dignity to the court. She was older and more experienced, which balanced out Henry's youthful recklessness. Catherine was a devoted Catholic, deeply spiritual, and took her queenly duties seriously. She managed the household with skill and impressed everyone with her intelligence. But more than anything, she shared Henry's dream to give England a strong line of heirs. Their love story started with laughter, pageantry, and hope, but fate wasn't kind. Catherine's pregnancies would become a heartbreaking cycle of loss and disappointment. Only one child survived infancy, Mary, the girl who would one day become Queen Mary I. But at the time, Henry wanted a son, and that hunger would change everything. Despite the struggles, Catherine remained fiercely loyal to Henry. She was strong, not just in faith, but in character. When Henry went off to war in France, Catherine acted as regent, running the kingdom in his absence. She even oversaw preparations for the English army's victory at Flodden against the Scots in 1513. That's right, the Queen was basically in charge of England's defence, while her husband played warrior abroad. Catherine wasn't just a decorative figure in jewels and gowns, she was a capable leader, a queen who proved her worth. People respected her. She carried herself with a quiet authority that earned admiration across the realm. But beneath the surface, storm clouds were gathering. Catherine's repeated failures to give Henry a living son weighed heavily. She grew older, her health wore down, and Henry's patience began to fray. Yet in these early years, before Anne Boleyn entered the scene, Catherine remained the true partner of Henry's reign. She was his counsellor, his queen, and in many ways his anchor. Without her, Henry's youthful reign might have spiraled out of control much sooner. History often remembers her as the discarded wife, but in these days, she was the heart of the Tudor dynasty. But beneath the surface, storm clouds were gathering. Catherine's repeated failures to give Henry a living son weighed heavily. She grew older, her health wore down, and Henry's patience began to fray. Yet in these early years, before Anne Boleyn entered the scene, Catherine remained the true partner of Henry's reign. She was his counsellor, his queen, and in many ways his anchor. Without her, Henry's youthful reign might have spiraled out of control much sooner. History often remembers her as the discarded wife, but in these days, she was the heart of the Tudor dynasty. So here she was, Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess who crossed the sea to become England's queen. She brought faith, dignity, and stability to a brand new dynasty still finding its feet. She endured loss, carried burdens with grace, and loved her husband even when fate seemed determined to test her. For Henry, Catherine was the queen of his youth, the one who stood beside him as he grew from an eager teenager into a ruling king. Their story began in promise and pageantry, and though it would end in heartbreak, Catherine's legacy was already sealed. She was no temporary guest in England's history, she was a queen in every sense of the word. At first, Henry and Catherine looked like the perfect royal couple. They had the pageantry, the charm, and the goodwill of the people. But as the years passed, one problem kept Henry up at night: no surviving male heir. Catherine endured multiple pregnancies, each greeted with bells and prayers, only for many to end in miscarriage, stillbirth, or early death. The only child to survive into adulthood was Mary. She was precious to Catherine, but Henry wanted a son. In his mind, daughters couldn't secure the Tudor throne the way a boy could. England was still shaky after the Wars of the Roses, and Henry feared civil war if the succession was uncertain. It wasn't just about family, it was about survival of the dynasty, and that's when the great matter began to take root. Henry's desperation for a son began to twist into something darker. He started to believe that God himself was punishing him. After all, Catherine had been his brother Arthur's wife first. Maybe the Pope's dispensation allowing their marriage had gone against divine law. Henry quoted the Bible verse from Leviticus: "If a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing, they shall be childless." Never mind that Catherine swore her first marriage had never been consummated. Henry's mind was fixed. He told himself and anyone who would listen that his lack of sons was a curse from heaven. But some historians whisper that Henry's guilt was just a mask for another truth. He was tired of Catherine, and another woman had already caught his eye. Before Anne Boleyn entered the picture, Henry had a string of mistresses. He was young, handsome, and not exactly famous for self-control. Court ladies were drawn to him, and Henry didn't resist. Catherine knew about his dalliances, but tolerated them as queens often did. She still loved him, and she still believed she was his rightful wife. But Henry was restless. His charm made him irresistible, and his position made him dangerous. Affairs didn't solve the heir problem, though. No mistress could give him a legitimate son. What he needed was a new wife, and that meant ending his marriage to Catherine, one way or another. Henry's desire for annulment turned into a political nightmare. The Pope, Clement VII, wasn't exactly free to hand out divorces. He was under the thumb of Catherine's nephew, none other than Charles V, the powerful Holy Roman Emperor. To grant Henry an annulment would insult Spain, anger the emperor, and throw Europe into chaos. For years, Henry's envoys begged, pleaded, and argued before the papal court. Henry wrote long letters full of scripture and legal reasoning, insisting his marriage was cursed. But Catherine stood her ground. She refused to agree that her marriage was invalid. She declared again and again that she was Henry's true wife, and Mary was his true heir. The stage was set for a battle that was part love story, part legal case, and part international scandal. Back in England, the people whispered. Catherine was popular, she was pious, loyal, and seen as a true queen. Many commoners pitied her as the aging wife abandoned by her husband. Henry, on the other hand, was starting to lose some shine. His endless pursuit of a male heir made him look desperate. But Henry didn't care. He was convinced that history demanded he secure a son. Catherine, despite years of loyalty, became an obstacle, and Henry was not a man who let obstacles stand for long. Behind the scenes, factions at court started to split, those loyal to Catherine and those who saw advantage in supporting Henry's pursuit of annulment. The Tudor court, once merry, was turning into a powder keg. What makes the great matter so fascinating is that it wasn't just personal, it was political and religious. By challenging his marriage, Henry was also challenging the authority of the Pope. Was the Bishop of Rome really more powerful than the King of England? This question started as Henry's private problem, but grew into something much larger. His advisors, like Cardinal Wolsey, tried to solve it, but Wolsey's failure to secure an annulment sealed his downfall. Henry's frustration boiled. He was king, yet he felt like a prisoner of Rome's decisions. Catherine, calm and unwavering, became a symbol of defiance. Every time Henry looked at her, he saw both the wife he once loved and the obstacle standing in his path. Meanwhile, Catherine never lost her dignity. Even as Henry grew colder, she clung to her faith and her role as queen. She continued her daily prayers, her acts of charity, and her quiet belief that God would protect her marriage. She didn't fight Henry with shouting matches, she fought with steadiness. In her eyes, giving in would mean betraying not just her vows, but also her daughter's right to inherit the throne. People admired her courage. In a world where women were often silenced, Catherine's refusal to bend made her legendary. Henry may have had the crown, but Catherine had the sympathy of the nation. As the years dragged on, Henry's obsession with the annulment grew. He wasn't just looking for freedom, he was looking for justification. He needed to convince his court, his country, and perhaps even himself, that his marriage was cursed. He surrounded himself with scholars who dug up every biblical loophole and historical precedent to support him. They wrote tracts, preached sermons, and argued endlessly that England's future required a new queen. But the longer it took, the more bitter Henry became. The king who once wrote love songs was now writing legal treatises. It wasn't romantic anymore, it was war. By the mid-1520s, the great matter was no longer just about Henry and Catherine. It was about power. Could the Pope dictate the future of England? Could a queen defy a king and still hold her ground? These questions would soon tear apart centuries of tradition. For now, though, Henry and Catherine were locked in a strange stalemate, husband and wife in name, but rivals in spirit. Their marriage, once celebrated with feasts and songs, had become a courtroom drama stretching across Europe, and behind the curtain, waiting for her entrance, was Anne Boleyn. She was about to step into the story, and everything would change, naitol if I mater. So this was the great matter. On the surface, it was about a man wanting a son, but underneath it was about love, power, faith and ambition colliding in ways that would alter the course of history. Catherine of Aragon held fast to her vows. Henry VIII searched for a loophole big enough to crown another wife, and the Pope, caught between England and Spain, stalled. For nearly a decade, this question consumed England. People didn't yet know it, but the Reformation was knocking on the door, and it all began with a husband, a wife and a marriage that could no longer hold. If Catherine of Aragon was known for her calm dignity, Anne Boleyn was known for her spark. She wasn't the most beautiful woman at court, at least not in the classic fairy tale princess sense, but she had something even more dangerous: charisma. Anne had been raised partly in France, serving in the courts of powerful noblewomen, and she came back to England with a confidence that stood out like a torch in the dark. She spoke French, dressed with flair, and carried herself with a sharp wit that made people pay attention. Where Catherine was steady and devout, Anne was lively and clever. Henry, who was getting tired of his long and fruitless marriage, noticed her right away, and once Henry noticed someone, well, the rest of the story starts writing itself. Anne wasn't just a pretty face. She had ambition. Unlike other women who might have been content to be Henry's mistress, Anne refused to play that role. She didn't want secret trysts or whispered promises. She wanted a crown. When Henry began to court her, she made it clear she would not be his unless she was his wife. It was a bold move. Any other court lady would have been flattered just to hold the king's attention. But Anne played the long game. She drew Henry in with letters, gifts, and witty banter, always keeping him just far enough away to drive him mad with wanting her. And it worked. The king, who could have any woman in the land, suddenly found himself chasing one who told him no. By the late 1520s, Henry's obsession with Anne was complete. He wrote her passionate love letters. Yes, the same king who would later behead her once signed his letters with HR. Surrounded by hearts. He promised her the world, jewels, titles, and most importantly the crown. Anne became the centre of his universe, and Catherine was pushed further aside. But the problem was still the same. Henry couldn't marry Anne unless he ended his marriage to Catherine. Thus the great matter took on a whole new urgency. Henry wasn't just seeking an annulment to have a son anymore. He was seeking it to have Anne. Catherine represented the past, Anne the dazzling future, and Henry always loved chasing the future. Anne wasn't universally adored, far from it. Her sharp tongue and fiery temper earned her as many enemies as admirers. Many at court, especially Catherine's supporters, saw her as nothing more than a homewrecker. She was called the king's whore in whispers behind closed doors. But Anne had a knack for survival. She allied herself with reform-minded churchmen who wanted to see England break away from Rome. Conveniently, their goals matched her own. If Henry separated from the Pope, he could marry Anne. Politics and passion joined forces, and suddenly the English Reformation had a face. Whether Anne intended it or not, she became the lightning rod for a religious revolution. Catherine, meanwhile, wasn't going anywhere. She refused to step aside, even as Henry grew colder. She continued to call herself the true queen, and the people continued to support her. This made Anne's rise even more precarious. To many, Anne represented scandal and danger. To Henry, she represented freedom and renewal. It was like England had split into two camps, Team Catherine and Team Anne. Imagine the Tudor court as a 16th century version of a messy reality TV show, except the prize wasn't a rose, it was a crown and the future of a dynasty. He secretly married Anne Boleyn, and soon after she was crowned queen in a grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey. The spectacle was dazzling, but not everyone celebrated. Crowds muttered that Catherine was the rightful queen, and many saw Anne as an interloper. Still, Anne must have felt triumphant. She had done what no other woman had managed. She turned down the king, held her ground, and made him move heaven and earth to marry her. She was no mistress now, she was Queen of England. Anne's marriage to Henry was passionate but volatile. He adored her wit and beauty, but he also clashed with her temper. Anne was no quiet Catherine. She argued back, teased him, and sometimes even humiliated him in front of others. For Henry, who was used to being worshipped, this was both intoxicating and infuriating. Their marriage started like a firework, all sparks and noise, but it didn't take long before the smoke began to sting. Still, Anne had one job above all: give Henry a son. When she gave birth in September 1533, it wasn't the prince Henry dreamed of, it was a daughter, Elizabeth. The disappointment was heavy, but Henry shrugged it off at first. Surely a son would follow. The years that followed were tough on Anne. She suffered multiple miscarriages, including the loss of a son, which left Henry frustrated and brooding. The same charm that had once captivated him began to wear thin under the weight of disappointment. Enemies at court whispered that she was cursed, that God was punishing England for Henry's betrayal of Catherine. Meanwhile, Anne's boldness and temper made her a target. Even those who had once supported her began to wonder if the gamble had been worth it. Henry, always restless, began to look elsewhere. The very woman who had replaced Catherine now feared she might be replaced herself. Anne wasn't ready to give up. She tried to keep Henry's attention with wit, charm, and her political alliances. She supported reformist thinkers, pushed her influence at court, and clung to her role as queen, but cracks were forming. Henry's eye had already fallen on another gentle, quiet woman, Jane Seymour. Compared to Anne's fire, Jane was soft and sweet, the perfect opposite. Anne sensed the danger, but there was little she could do. For a woman who had fought so hard to win the crown, it must have felt like sand slipping through her fingers. Anne Boleyn's story had begun as a daring romance, a gamble that reshaped history. She had captivated a king, toppled a queen, and worn the crown herself, but her position was never secure. To Henry, love was conditional, and loyalty was fragile. In time, Anne would learn that being queen was as dangerous as it was glamorous. For now though, she was still the dazzling figure who turned England upside down, the woman who taught Henry that saying no could be the most powerful weapon of all. The fire had been lit, and soon it would burn too brightly. By 1533, Henry's patience with Rome had snapped like an overused lute string. For nearly a decade, he had begged, argued, and bullied the Pope to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Nothing worked. The Pope stalled, hemmed, and hawed, mostly because Catherine's nephew was Charles V, the most powerful man in Europe. Offending him wasn't on the papal to-do list, but Henry wasn't a man who liked being told no. If the Pope wouldn't give him what he wanted, then Henry would simply go around him. It was bold, reckless, and just a little bit arrogant, but that was Henry VIII in a nutshell. The solution was radical. Henry declared that he, not the Pope, was the supreme head of the Church in England. Imagine the shock. Centuries of tradition flipped overnight. Priests, bishops, and nobles suddenly found themselves answering to the king instead of Rome. This was the birth of the Church of England. To Henry, it wasn't about deep theological reform at first. He wasn't Luther or Calvin. He wasn't dreaming of tearing down Catholic doctrine. He just wanted control of his marriage, control of his church, control of his future. And breaking with Rome gave him exactly that. Once the break was official, Henry wasted no time. He had secretly married Anne Boleyn already, and now he wanted the world to see her as his rightful queen. In June 1533, Anne was crowned at Westminster Abbey in a lavish ceremony, dripping with gold, banners, and pageantry. It was supposed to be a moment of triumph, proof that Henry had won. But there was a shadow in the crowd. Many Londoners didn't cheer. They muttered Catherine's name, whispering that Anne was no true queen. Even as she sat crowned, Anne knew her place was shaky. The crown glittered, yes, but it was heavy. Drôle player blag. For Henry, the real prize was still to come, a son. Anne was pregnant by the time of her coronation, and Henry strutted about like a man who had finally beaten fate. He told everyone that God had blessed his second marriage, and he was certain the child would be male. England buzzed with expectation. Pamphlets promised a bright future, nobles planned feasts, and Henry polished his jousting armor as though his heir would be born in a blaze of glory. But in September 1533, Anne gave birth, not to a prince, but to a princess. The child was named Elizabeth. Henry hid his disappointment behind a smile, but inside, frustration brewed. A daughter was fine, but it wasn't the son he had gambled his kingdom on. Elizabeth's birth didn't stop the celebrations completely. Henry announced that she was the future of England, though everyone knew he was already thinking ahead to the next pregnancy. Elizabeth, of course, would go on to become one of the greatest monarchs in English history, but in 1533, she was just another royal baby, and a disappointment to her father. Anne, however, adored her daughter. She poured affection into Elizabeth, insisting she would be strong, clever, and worthy of the crown someday. In many ways, Anne's love and ambition planted seeds that Elizabeth would carry into her own reign. While Anne doted on Elizabeth, Henry began reshaping England's religious landscape. Monasteries, long seen as bastions of Catholic wealth and influence, came under attack. Henry sent inspectors, confiscated lands, and stripped treasures. This wasn't just about faith, it was about money and power. The crown's coffers swelled as gold and silver poured in from dissolved monasteries. Some common folk grumbled, but others saw opportunity. Overnight, England's religious and political map was being redrawn, all because Henry wanted to be free of one woman and married to another. The break with Rome also divided the people. Some accepted Henry's new role as head of the church, happy to follow their king. Others saw it as heresy, an outrageous rebellion against the Pope. Families argued, parishes split, and the air grew heavy with suspicion. Spies and informants whispered in taverns, noting who supported Catherine and who supported Anne. England wasn't just a kingdom anymore, it was a powder keg of faith and politics. And in the center of it all stood Henry, convinced that he had done what was necessary, but unaware of how far the consequences would reach. Anne, meanwhile, tried to embrace her new role. As queen, she threw herself into court life, supporting scholars, artists, and reformers. She had style and intelligence, and she knew how to use them. But she also had enemies. Catherine's supporters still called her the usurper. Rumors swirled about her sharp tongue and quick temper. Henry's love was still strong, but he was known to shift moods like the English weather, sunny one moment, stormy the next. For now, though, Anne's crown was secure. She was queen, Elizabeth was heir, and the old order had been shattered to make room for them. Henry may have felt triumphant, but his actions sent shockwaves across Europe. The Pope excommunicated him, and Catholic rulers scowled from their thrones. Spain and France eyed England warily. To them, Henry looked less like a bold reformer and more like a reckless gambler who had destabilized an entire continent. But Henry didn't care. He strutted about in his palaces, proud of his break with Rome, proud of his new queen, and still dreaming of a son. To him, Elizabeth's birth wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. So here we are. The year is 1533, and England has a new church, a new queen, and a brand new princess. Catherine of Aragon has been set aside, Anne Boleyn wears the crown, and Henry walks taller than ever. But beneath the glitter, cracks are forming. The break with Rome has made enemies abroad and enemies at home. Anne's triumph is real, but fragile. And Elizabeth, the baby cradled in her mother's arms, is destined to prove that history doesn't always follow the plans of kings. For now, though, the story rests on a man who defied the Pope, a woman who gambled for a crown, and a child who would one day outshine them both. Anne Boleyn's rise had been dazzling, but her fall would be just as dramatic. After years of chasing her, Henry VIII had changed the entire religion of England to make her queen. That's a lot of pressure to live up to. At first, Henry was besotted. He showered Anne with jewels, called her his darling, and strutted about like a proud rooster. But Anne's fiery personality, which had once made her irresistible, began to wear on him. She argued, she teased, she refused to be quiet, and most of all, she failed to give him the son he craved. After Elizabeth, Anne suffered miscarriages, including one tragic loss of a baby boy. Each disappointment pushed Henry further from passion into frustration. The love story that had set Europe buzzing was turning sour. Anne's enemies at court were circling like hawks. Many nobles had never forgiven her for replacing Catherine of Aragon. Now, with her position weakening, they sensed opportunity. Courtiers whispered about her temper, about her French manners, about her arrogance. Some even claimed she bewitched Henry into marriage. Superstition mixed with politics, always a dangerous cocktail. Thomas Cromwell, once her ally, turned against her. He saw Anne as a threat to his influence and a convenient scapegoat for Henry's growing discontent. At court, loyalty could flip overnight, and Anne was beginning to look like yesterday's queen. The final straw came in 1536. Anne miscarried a son, and Henry's disappointment turned into something darker. By now, Jane Seymour, gentle, quiet, and everything Anne was not, had caught his attention. Compared to Anne's fire, Jane seemed like a safe harbour. Henry began openly courting her, and Anne could see the writing on the wall. The queen who had once made Henry defy the Pope was now being pushed aside for a woman who barely raised her voice. History can be cruel that way. The bold woman blazes trails, but the quiet one wins the day. In April 1536, Anne was arrested on shocking charges: adultery, incest, and treason. It sounds outrageous, and it was. Historians generally agree the accusations were cooked up, a convenient way to remove Anne without messy complications. But in Henry's England, truth mattered less than appearances. Anne was taken to the Tower of London, once a symbol of her triumph when she stayed there before her coronation, now a cage for her downfall. For a queen who had been crowned with such glittering pomp, the sight of her being led through the Tower gates must have felt like a cruel joke from fate. Anne's trial was a spectacle. Held in the Great Hall of the Tower, it was attended by nobles, courtiers, and enemies eager to see her fall. She stood accused of betraying the king with multiple lovers, including her own brother, George Boleyn. The charges were flimsy, the evidence thinner than parchment, but the verdict was already decided. Anne defended herself with courage, insisting she was innocent. Even her enemies admitted she spoke with grace and intelligence. But it didn't matter. In the Tudor court, when the king wanted someone gone, they were gone. On May 15, 1536, Anne was found guilty. The sentence, death by burning or beheading, at the king's choice. Henry, ever the practical man, chose beheading, merciful by his standards. Anne's execution was scheduled for a few days later. She prepared with remarkable calm, spending her last hours in prayer. Those who saw her in the Tower noted her composure. She was only about 35, once the most powerful woman in England, now condemned. She had gambled for the crown and won, only to lose everything. On May 19, 1536, Anne was led to the scaffold built within the Tower grounds. She wore a dark gown and a cloak of ermine. A crowd gathered, courtiers, guards, common folk, all watching the fall of a queen. Anne gave a final speech, careful not to blame Henry. She praised the king and asked God to protect him. It was both dignity and survival instinct. She knew her family's fate depended on her words. She knelt before the executioner, who had been specially brought from France for his skill. With a single stroke of the sword, Anne Boleyn's life ended. Roan Wayon's head fell. England seemed to take a sharp breath. The queen who had toppled Catherine, reshaped the church, and lit up Henry's passion was gone. Within a day, Henry was engaged to Jane Seymour. That's right, he wasted no time. For Henry, queens were replaceable, but sons were not. Anne was erased as quickly as she had risen. Yet her story refused to die. Whispers spread that she had been innocent, that she had been framed, that Henry had destroyed a woman just to get what he wanted. Whether people loved her or hated her, no one could forget her. Roan Waysaparling was one more could forget her. Elizabeth, Anne's daughter, was only a toddler at the time. Declared illegitimate, she was pushed aside in the line of succession. Few could have guessed that this little girl, set aside as a bastard, would one day become Elizabeth I, one of the greatest monarchs in English history. Anne never lived to see her daughter's triumph, but her bloodline endured. In a strange twist of fate, the woman who died accused of treason left behind a child who would outshine all of Henry's sons. Anne Boleyn's fall was as fast as her rise. From glittering coronation to cold scaffold, her story became legend. To some, she was a schemer who played with fire and lost. To others, she was a victim of a ruthless king and a treacherous court. But one thing is certain, Anne changed England forever. Without her, there might have been no break with Rome, no Church of England, and no Elizabeth I. She may have died young, but her shadow stretched across centuries. In life and in death, Anne Boleyn refused to be forgotten. Barely a day after Anne Boleyn's execution, Henry VIII was already making plans. His heart, or at least his ambition, had shifted to Jane Seymour, a quiet, modest woman who seemed like the complete opposite of fiery Anne. Jane came from a respectable, but not overly powerful family. She had served as a lady-in-waiting to both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, quietly watching the storms of court life swirl around her. She wasn't glamorous, she wasn't flashy, but she had something Henry now craved: gentleness, obedience, and calm. After years of drama, Jane was like a breath of fresh, uncomplicated air. Henry and Jane were betrothed almost immediately after Anne's death. The speed shocked everyone. Imagine the gossip: one queen dead on Friday, a new engagement by Monday. But Henry didn't seem embarrassed. In fact, he seemed relieved. Jane was praised for her kindness and humility, and Henry played up the contrast. Where Anne had been bold, Jane was soft. Where Catherine had been stubborn, Jane was accommodating. Henry liked to present Jane as the ideal wife, the one who would finally bring peace to his household. He wasn't wrong. Jane wasn't looking for political power. She wanted to do her duty, marry, obey, and give Henry the son he longed for. In May 1536, just days after Anne's execution, Henry married Jane Seymour. By June, she was officially queen. Her coronation was more subdued than Anne's, partly because Henry was trying to move on quickly, and partly because England was still whispering about the scandal. But Jane didn't seem to mind. She wore the crown lightly, never pushing for grandeur. She was content to play the role of a dutiful queen, organizing charity for the poor, speaking gently to courtiers, and making sure her household ran smoothly. For a man like Henry who loved control, Jane was perfect. She didn't challenge him, she soothed him. But Jane wasn't just a soft voice in the background. She had opinions, and occasionally she showed them. Once she tried to persuade Henry to restore his daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, to the line of succession. Henry was furious, reminding Jane not to meddle in his affairs. It was a rare glimpse of the limits of her influence. Still, Jane managed to reconcile Henry with Princess Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, showing her compassionate streak. It was a small victory, but it revealed Jane's true nature. She wasn't trying to be a political powerhouse. She wanted peace in a family that had been torn apart by drama. Jane's defining moment came in 1537, when she became pregnant. The entire court held its breath. This was Henry's third queen, and everyone knew what was at stake. The kingdom prayed for a boy. When news spread that Jane was carrying a child, Henry was overjoyed. He fussed over her, gave her gifts, and declared that England would finally have the prince it deserved. For Jane, the pressure must have been enormous. She was carrying not just a baby, but the entire Tudor dynasty on her shoulders. In October 1537, Jane gave birth to a healthy baby boy, Edward. Henry was beside himself with joy. He finally had what he had been chasing for decades, a legitimate male heir. The bells of London rang out, bonfires were lit, and feasts were held across England. Henry paraded around like a man reborn, declaring Jane the savior of his dynasty. For once, his gamble had paid off. The boy was christened Edward, and all of England celebrated. Jane had delivered the prize that Catherine and Anne never could. But joy was followed by tragedy. The birth had been long and exhausting, and Jane grew gravely ill in the days afterward. While Henry feasted and celebrated, Jane weakened. Within 2 weeks she was dead, gone at only 29 years old. It was a cruel twist of fate. She had given Henry his greatest joy, and paid for it with her life. The court plunged into mourning. Henry, for all his ruthlessness, was truly devastated. Unlike Catherine and Anne, whom he had discarded, Jane was remembered with tenderness. Henry would call her his true wife, the one he loved most. He even chose to be buried beside her after his own death. Jane's death marked a turning point in Henry's life. He had finally gotten his son, but the cost was high. After her passing, Henry became more cynical, more bitter. The dazzling young king who once danced and sang love songs was fading. In Jane's quiet, obedient nature, Henry had found comfort, but it was gone too soon. Perhaps that's why he remembered her so fondly. She never lived long enough to argue with him, to disappoint him, or to clash with his temper. In memory, Jane stayed perfect. For the people of England, Jane's death was also bittersweet. She had given them a male heir, something they believed secured the future. But she had also shown kindness and humility, making her beloved among common folk. Unlike Anne, she was not seen as a schemer. Unlike Catherine, she was not seen as stubborn. She was remembered as gentle, pious, and selfless. In the legend of Henry's 6 wives, Jane became the good queen, the one who delivered what the king wanted most, and the one who paid the ultimate price. So ends the story of Jane Seymour, the dutiful wife who gave Henry his long-awaited son, but didn't live to see him grow. Henry would marry again, 3 more times in fact, but Jane held a special place in his heart. He may have broken with Rome for Anne, and fought bitter battles with Catherine, but it was Jane who gave him what he wanted most. In the quiet of St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, where Jane and Henry lie together, history whispers her name. Gentle, modest Jane, the queen who gave everything, and left behind the one child Henry truly treasured. After Jane Seymour's death, Henry VIII was a changed man. The joy of finally having a son was overshadowed by the grief of losing the wife he called his true queen. For the first time in his reign, Henry seemed hollow. He had spent his youth chasing glory, romance, and heirs, but now he found himself facing middle age with a heavy heart. His once athletic body began to slow down. He was growing heavier, his legs often swollen and painful. The dazzling young king who had danced all night at feasts was fading. England still looked to him for strength, but inside Henry felt more alone than ever before. Court, once lively with music and laughter, took on a different mood. Without Jane, Henry withdrew into himself. He still entertained, still demanded obedience, but the spark was dimmer. He had lost not just a wife but the idea of simple happiness. People noticed the change. Ambassadors wrote home describing a king who was more suspicious, more brooding. Henry, who once relished in being adored, now seemed guarded. He trusted fewer people. Every smile at court could be a lie, every bow a mask. In some ways, Jane's death cracked open the darker side of his soul, and it was beginning to spill out. Henry's health began to betray him. Years of jousting, hunting, and heavy feasting caught up quickly. He suffered from painful ulcers on his legs that often refused to heal. Walking became difficult, and exercise was no longer possible. This change was more than physical. It chipped away at his pride. Henry had built his image on being the strong, handsome, golden king. Now he was slower, heavier, and often in pain. He hated being reminded of it. Courtiers who dared mention his ailments risked his wrath. The once vibrant monarch was turning into a man trapped in his own failing body. Yet even in grief and pain, Henry remained king, and kings needed wives. His advisors began pressing him to remarry. England's stability depended on alliances, and foreign courts were watching closely. Henry hesitated. Jane's memory still lingered, but politics had no patience for mourning. Matches were suggested, letters exchanged, portraits painted. Henry knew he couldn't rule alone. A king without a queen looked weak. Still, the thought of starting over weighed on him. He had already buried 3 wives, one in disgrace, one in rejection, and one in death. How many more would fate demand? It was during this time that Thomas Cromwell, Henry's most trusted advisor, stepped in with bold plans. Cromwell believed Henry needed a foreign alliance, and he began arranging a match with Anne of Cleves, a German princess. To Henry, the idea of another marriage was both a duty and a burden. He was no longer the romantic prince chasing love songs and dances. Marriage was business now, another tool in the great chessboard of Europe. Still, Henry insisted on one thing: if he was going to marry again, she had to please him. He would learn soon enough that even Cromwell's careful plans couldn't guarantee that. But before Anne of Cleves entered the picture, Henry spent a rare stretch of time single. For nearly 2 years, he remained officially unmarried, the only gap in his parade of queens. Those years showed a man wrestling with his own mortality. He grew harsher, more quick-tempered. Executions became more common, paranoia more frequent. Some courtiers whispered that Jane's death had broken something inside him. For Henry, being alone wasn't freedom, it was fear. He had heirs to secure, enemies to outwit, and a crown that always felt a little too heavy. The king who once thrived on love was now beginning to thrive on power alone. Henry's relationship with his children during this time was complicated. Princess Mary, daughter of Catherine, was cautiously brought back into favour, though never fully trusted. Elizabeth, Anne's daughter, was declared illegitimate, but still doted on in private moments. And baby Edward, Jane's son, became the jewel of Henry's crown. Henry adored him, but the boy was fragile, often ill. The thought of losing his only son haunted him. Henry wasn't just a grieving husband now, he was a nervous father, clinging to the future of the Tudor dynasty. Henry's loneliness also deepened his suspicion of friends and allies. Even Cromwell, who had served him so faithfully, found himself walking on thin ice. Henry's moods could swing wildly, one day generous, the next cruel. Without Jane's calming presence, his temper ruled the court. People began describing him not as the Golden Prince, but as a tyrant. He had once dazzled with his charm, now he ruled with fear. Being alone did not soften him, it hardened him. And that hardness would soon shape his next marriages, for better or worse. The king's body and spirit were fading, but his appetite for control never did. He demanded obedience from his court, reverence from his people, and loyalty from his family. His loneliness, paradoxically, made him cling tighter to power. In private, he may have mourned Jane. In public, he made sure no one doubted his strength. The line between man and king blurred. Henry was no longer just a husband searching for love. He was a ruler obsessed with legacy. And legacy meant keeping the crown steady on Tudor heads, no matter what it cost. So here was Henry VIII in the years after Jane Seymour, grieving, heavier, more suspicious, yet still hungry for control. For a brief moment he stood without a queen, surrounded by wealth, power, and fear, but not love. The story of the golden boy had shifted. This was the story of a man who had gotten everything he wanted, an heir, a kingdom, unmatched power, and still found himself unsatisfied. Soon, advisors would push him toward another match, another gamble, another queen. But in this moment, Henry was simply a man alone, sitting in the shadows of his own ambition. By the late 1530s, Henry VIII was once again in need of a wife. Jane Seymour was gone, and though Henry had his precious son, Edward, he still needed stability, and of course more heirs if possible. Europe was a dangerous place, full of rivalries and shifting alliances. Henry's chief advisor, Thomas Cromwell, thought it was time to strengthen ties with the German states. His plan? A political marriage to Anne of Cleves, the sister of a powerful duke. She was Protestant, which meant aligning with her family would give England protection against Catholic powers like Spain and France. To Cromwell, it was perfect. To Henry, it was, well, let's just say things didn't go quite as smoothly. Henry had not seen Anne in person before agreeing to the marriage, which was risky business. Instead, he relied on a portrait painted by the famous artist Hans Holbein. The painting showed Anne as dignified, modest, and attractive enough for a queen. Henry was pleased with what he saw. Bring her to England, he declared, convinced that fate had delivered him the perfect bride. But portraits, as we know, can be flattering. Anne's picture would soon prove to be one of the most infamous works of art in royal matchmaking history. When Anne finally arrived in England in 1540, Henry was excited to meet her. He disguised himself in typical knightly fashion, planning to surprise her with a romantic reveal, like something out of a chivalric romance. Unfortunately, Anne didn't play along. She didn't recognize him, didn't swoon, and barely reacted at all. Henry's pride took a hit. When he finally saw her properly, his disappointment grew. He grumbled that she looked nothing like her portrait, calling her the Flanders mare, not exactly the most romantic start to a marriage. Despite his disappointment, Henry couldn't just back out without causing a political mess. England needed the German alliance, so the wedding went ahead in January 1540. The ceremony was grand, the feasts plentiful, but behind the smiles Henry was sulking. He later claimed that he was unable to consummate the marriage, blaming Anne's appearance and manner. Historians debate what really happened. Some think Henry's health or pride was more at fault than Anne's looks. Either way, the king felt trapped in a union he despised almost from day one. Anne, for her part, was bewildered. She had been raised in a quiet provincial German court, with little exposure to English customs. She wasn't trained in music or flirtation, which Henry adored. Instead, she was straightforward, modest, and practical. To Henry, this came off as dull. To Anne, she had simply been married into a strange world with a grumpy husband. She tried to be respectful, but the spark Henry demanded just wasn't there. By summer of 1540, Henry had had enough. He claimed the marriage had never been consummated and pushed for an annulment. Anne, perhaps realizing that fighting would only bring disaster, agreed without protest. She accepted the title of the king's beloved sister and was given a generous settlement, money, estates, and even castles. For a woman whose marriage had flopped spectacularly, Anne landed on her feet. She remained in England for the rest of her life, living comfortably, far from the deadly fate of some of Henry's other wives. Henry, meanwhile, was furious with Cromwell. The marriage was his idea, and Henry blamed him entirely. Once the king's most trusted advisor, Cromwell quickly found himself in danger. In a brutal twist of court politics, Cromwell was arrested, charged with treason, and executed in the same year that Anne's marriage ended. For Cromwell, Anne of Cleves was not just the political bride, it was his downfall. Henry had rid himself of both a wife and an advisor in one sweep. Anne, however, adapted surprisingly well. She learned English quickly, embraced her new role as beloved sister, and stayed on good terms with Henry. She even got along with his children, Mary and Elizabeth. Unlike Catherine or Anne Boleyn, she wasn't a tragic figure. Instead, she became a survivor, navigating the dangerous waters of Henry's court with calm and grace. When visitors from abroad saw her, they noted that she seemed happy, even without the crown. Henry may have mocked Anne, but he respected her enough not to harm her. She was one of the very few who walked away from marriage to Henry VIII not only alive but well off. She lived comfortably in England for years, occasionally visiting court, always treated with honor. When Henry married again to Catherine Howard, Anne's replacement, Anne even sent gifts. She wasn't bitter, she was practical. Perhaps that's why she survived while so many others didn't. Anne of Cleves may not have been the queen Henry wanted, but she turned out to be the queen who outlived the storm. She came to England a stranger, endured a humiliating marriage, and yet carved out a life of peace. In the gallery of Henry's 6 wives, she is often overlooked, sandwiched between Anne Boleyn's drama and Catherine Howard's tragedy. But her story is unique. She was the political bride who became the survivor, remembered not for her crown but for her resilience. Anne of Cleves may not have been the queen Henry wanted, But she turned out to be the queen who outlived the storm. She came to England a stranger, endured a humiliating marriage, and yet carved out a life of peace. In the gallery of Henry's 6 wives, she is often overlooked, sandwiched between Anne Boleyn's drama and Catherine Howard's tragedy. But her story is unique. She was the political bride who became the survivor, remembered not for her crown but for her resilience. Henry fell hard and fast. Catherine reminded him of the youth he had lost. Her laughter, her dancing, her flirtations brought life back to his aging world. He showered her with jewels, gowns, and affection. He called her his rose without a thorn, a phrase that would later sound bitterly ironic. For Catherine, the king's attention must have been overwhelming. She was still practically a girl, suddenly elevated to Queen of England. It wasn't love in the romantic sense, it was power, status, and survival. Few could say no to Henry, and Catherine wasn't in a position to try. In 1540, Henry married Catherine Howard in a blaze of celebration. The court rejoiced that the king seemed happy again, and Henry strutted proudly with his young bride on his arm. But underneath the sparkle, there were cracks. Catherine had a complicated past. Before marrying Henry, she had been involved in romances with younger men, something her enemies at court would later use against her. At the time, though, Henry either didn't know or didn't care. He was too busy showing off his bride, convinced that he had found joy again. Catherine loved the pleasures of court life. She adored fine clothes, dancing, and the attention that came with being queen. But Henry's world was not easy. He was sick, irritable, and increasingly paranoid. Catherine, still a teenager, may have found comfort in the company of men closer to her own age. Rumours began to swirl that she was too close to certain courtiers, especially Thomas Culpeper. At first, these were just whispers, but in Henry's court, whispers could turn deadly. In 1541, things came crashing down. A former court rival exposed Catherine's past relationships, and evidence of her closeness with Culpeper surfaced. For Henry, it was a devastating humiliation. He had adored her, given her everything, and called her his rose without a thorn. Now he felt betrayed. His pride, his reputation, and his authority were all wounded. And Henry was not the kind of man to forgive betrayal. The queen, who once represented youth and renewal, was suddenly branded an adulteress. Catherine was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London, the same grim walls that had claimed her cousin Anne Boleyn just years before. She was barely 19. Imagine the terror of a teenager, once the glittering Queen of England, now pacing in a cold stone cell. Witnesses said she wept uncontrollably, sometimes shrieking in despair. Unlike Anne, who had faced her fate with steely calm, Catherine was overwhelmed by fear. She was too young, too unprepared, too lost in the deadly game of Tudor politics. Her trial was swift and brutal. Charged with treason through adultery, Catherine had little chance of survival. The court condemned her, and Henry signed the death warrant. On February 13, 1542, Catherine was led to the scaffold within the Tower grounds. Witnesses said she was pale, but tried to compose herself. In her final speech, she admitted her faults and asked for God's mercy. She was so young that many in the crowd wept at the sight. Her life had been short, glittering for a moment, then cut down like a candle snuffed out in the wind. Henry was devastated, but in a very different way than with Jane Seymour. Catherine's betrayal stung his pride more than his heart. He had believed she adored him, that her youth made him strong again. Instead, her downfall made him look foolish. From then on, Henry grew even more paranoid and bitter. His court became a place of suspicion, where love was no longer about passion but about survival. Catherine's fate served as a grim warning. Being Henry's queen could be the most dangerous job in England. For the people of England, Catherine's story was shocking. Some pitied her as a naive girl who had been thrust into a role far too dangerous. Others condemned her as foolish and reckless. Either way, she became another cautionary tale in Henry's bloody string of marriages. Catherine had been the king's joy, his fleeting hope of youth, but she ended as another victim of his ruthless reign. She was only 19 when the axe fell. So ends the story of Catherine Howard, the tragic young bride. She was lively, playful, and full of promise, but she walked into a storm she could never survive. To Henry, she had been a rose without a thorn, but roses, as we know, have thorns hidden deep. Catherine's downfall revealed the truth about Henry's world. Love and beauty could bring you the crown, but only fear and power could help you keep it. For a brief shining moment, Catherine danced through the halls of history, but her song ended too soon. By the 1540s, Henry VIII was no longer the dashing prince of his youth. The man who once jousted, danced, and charmed the courts of Europe was now overweight, often in pain, and haunted by suspicion. His leg ulcers grew so severe that he could barely walk. He was carried about in special chairs, his once bright eyes dulled by age and illness. Yet even as his body weakened, his temper and pride grew stronger. Courtiers whispered that he was no longer just a king, he was a tyrant. Henry demanded obedience. feared betrayal, and lashed out at anyone who dared cross him. Henry's paranoia reached new heights. Friends and allies who had once been close to him now lived in constant fear. At the start of his reign, he had laughed and joked with courtiers. Now his laugh was rare, and his anger came quickly. High-ranking nobles, advisors, and even former allies were accused of treason and executed. It didn't take much. A careless word, a rumor, a whisper of disloyalty, and heads would roll. The man who once wrote love songs was now signing death warrants with a steady hand. Henry's shifting alliances in Europe also kept the kingdom on edge. One year he leaned toward France, the next he tilted toward Spain. His decisions weren't always about careful strategy, they were often about pride. He wanted to prove he was still a player on the European stage, even as his body failed him. Wars and campaigns drained England's treasury, but Henry insisted on building great ships and forts, showing that England was still strong. The seeds of the Royal Navy were planted in these years, not from vision but from Henry's refusal to appear weak. At home, religion remained a constant storm. The break with Rome had fractured England, and Henry's shifting moods made things worse. One day he leaned Protestant, another day Catholic. Those who guessed wrong about where the king's faith rested risked the scaffold. Bishops, monks, and reformers lived in fear, never sure if Henry would brand them heretics or heroes. For Henry, religion was less about theology and more about control. He had broken with Rome to get what he wanted, and now he guarded his religious authority with an iron fist. Henry's daughters also lived in uncertainty. Mary, once declared illegitimate, had been restored to some degree of favor but never fully trusted. Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, grew up clever and cautious, well aware of the dangers of her father's court. Henry loved his son Edward most, but Edward was frail and often ill. Henry's obsession with his son's survival only deepened his fears. He saw ghosts of instability everywhere, terrified that the Tudor dynasty he had fought so hard to build might collapse after his death. As his health declined, Henry's temper grew legendary. Courtiers learned to read his moods like sailors reading the weather. A smile could mean favor, a frown could mean exile, or worse. One ambassador described Henry as more feared than loved, a man whose presence commanded silence. He lashed out at those closest to him, sometimes executing men who had served him faithfully for decades. It was dangerous to be near Henry, but equally dangerous to be far from him. Everyone wanted his favor, but few held it for long. Champernexinti is Maitiobo, Ignilbowed in magnificent palaces, filled his halls with rich tapestries, and dined on feasts that groaned with roasted meats and wine. These displays of wealth were not just for comfort, they were a message. I am still powerful, I am still king. His clothes became heavier with jewels, his throne grander, his ceremonies more elaborate. In some ways the splendor was a mask, hiding the decaying man beneath the crown. By this time, Henry's marriages had become infamous across Europe. 6 wives, 2 executed, 2 set aside, 1 dead, and 1 still to come. Foreign rulers shook their heads, mocking England's king for his marital adventures, but Henry didn't care about their opinions. He still believed he was God's chosen ruler, destined to do whatever was necessary to protect his throne. In his later years, he seemed almost defiant, daring anyone, pope, emperor, or courtier, to stand in his way. Yet, for all his bluster, Henry was a man haunted. He carried the memories of his wives, his mistakes, and his endless hunger for sons. Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, each had left a mark on him. Some he remembered with tenderness, others with bitterness. But together, they formed the mosaic of his life, shaping him into the man he had become. In his later years, Henry was less a lover and more a survivor, clinging to power even as time slipped through his fingers. So here was Henry VIII, in his later years, no longer the radiant prince, but a heavy, suspicious king ruling through fear. His body ached, his court trembled, and his enemies circled, yet his will remained iron. He had broken with Rome, changed the course of England, and rewritten the rules of monarchy. But he had also left a trail of blood, broken hearts, and enemies in his wake. Henry's story was not over. 2 more wives would follow, but the man who once charmed Europe was now remembered as a tyrant, a king who had everything and still wanted more. By the mid-1540s, Henry VIII was worn down. He was older, heavier, often carried in a chair instead of walking, and more feared than loved. Yet, unbelievably, he still wasn't done with marriage. Enter Catherine Parr, the 6th and final wife. Unlike Henry's other queens, Catherine wasn't chosen for youth, beauty, or foreign alliances. She was chosen for her steadiness. Catherine was twice widowed, intelligent, calm, and known for her kindness. She wasn't a teenager like Catherine Howard or a bold firebrand like Anne Boleyn. She was practical, mature, and most importantly, wise enough to survive Henry's moods. Catherine Parr had never dreamed of being queen. In fact, she had been in love with another man, Thomas Seymour, the brother of Jane Seymour. But when the king proposed, saying no wasn't an option, marrying Henry meant duty, not romance. Still, Catherine approached the role with grace. She accepted her fate and decided to make the best of it. She would not just be Henry's wife, she would be a peacemaker, a stepmother, and even in some ways a healer. One of Catherine's greatest strengths was her ability to bring Henry's fractured family together. His daughters Mary and Elizabeth had long been sidelined, declared illegitimate, and shuffled about in the chaos of their fathers' marriages. Catherine welcomed them back with warmth, treating them like her own. She created a household that felt less like a battlefield and more like a family. Elizabeth, in particular, was deeply influenced by Catherine's intelligence and religious devotion. In many ways, Catherine Parr helped shape the young princess into the queen she would later become. Catherine was also highly educated. She loved books, spoke several languages, and was deeply involved in religious debates of the time. In fact, she was the first English queen to publish a book under her own name. For Henry, this was both impressive and dangerous. He admired her intelligence, but religious reform was still a hot and deadly issue. One wrong phrase could get you branded a heretic. Catherine's Protestant leanings put her at risk, especially when her enemies whispered in Henry's ear that she was plotting against him. Indeed, Catherine's intelligence nearly cost her life. In 1546, her opponents at court convinced Henry that she was spreading heresy. A warrant was drawn up for her arrest. Catherine found out just in time and hurried to Henry's side. She soothed his anger with clever words, telling him she only debated religion to distract him from his pain and to learn from his wisdom. Flattered, Henry forgave her. When guards arrived the next day with the warrant, Henry dismissed them, claiming his wife was blameless. Catherine had outmaneuvered death itself with quick thinking and calm charm. Beyond her clever survival, Catherine was also a compassionate caregiver. Henry's health was failing fast. His leg ulcers smelled foul, his weight made him immobile, and his temper was terrible. Yet Catherine nursed him, soothed him, and managed the court when he could not. It was not a glamorous role, but it was vital. She gave the aging king dignity where little remained. Even Henry, who often turned on his wives, respected Catherine deeply for her loyalty in his worst years. Catherine's greatest victory, however, was her ability to survive. Out of 6 queens, she was the one who managed to outlive Henry. She endured the tempests of his moods, the plots of his enemies, and the dangers of his court, and walked away alive. When Henry died in 1547, Catherine was finally free. She was still relatively young, and for the first time she could choose her own path. She remarried quickly, this time to her true love, Thomas Seymour. For once, her heart had a say in her life. Catherine's final years were brief but bittersweet. She enjoyed her marriage to Thomas Seymour, but scandal soon followed. Thomas was ambitious, and his behavior caused whispers at court. Still, Catherine found happiness in their union, and in 1548, she gave birth to a daughter, Mary Seymour. Sadly, Catherine's story ended not long after. Complications from childbirth took her life. In a tragic twist, the survivor of Henry VIII's wives did not survive her own final chapter. Despite her early death, Catherine Parr's legacy was profound. She had outlived Henry, helped reconcile his fractured family, and guided Elizabeth in ways that would later echo through history. She showed that survival at Henry's court required not just beauty or obedience, but intelligence, patience, and quick wit. She wasn't remembered for scandal, betrayal, or tragedy. She was remembered for her resilience. Among the 6 wives, she was the quiet victor. Ron Tro. So ends the story of Catherine Parr, the survivor. She wasn't the most famous, nor the most glamorous of Henry's wives, but she played her part with grace. She outlasted the king who destroyed so many lives, and in her steadiness, she gave England something precious, a glimpse of peace in a stormy reign. When history whispers the names of Henry's queens, Catherine Parr stands as the one who endured, the last chapter of a story written in blood, ambition, and fragile crowns. By the mid-1540s, Henry VIII was a shadow of the man who once dazzled Europe. The golden prince who had jousted, danced, and composed love songs was long gone. In his place was an overweight, sickly, suspicious king, carried in chairs when he could no longer walk. His leg ulcers were so painful and infected that the stench was said to fill the rooms he occupied. Yet even as his body betrayed him, Henry clung to power with iron fists. To his courtiers, he was terrifying, unpredictable, quick to rage, and ruthless to the very end. Henry's mind remained sharp, but his moods were darker than ever. He suspected plots everywhere, even among his closest allies. Once beloved friends like Thomas More and Thomas Cromwell had already fallen to the axe. Now Henry trusted almost no one. Courtiers learned to bow low, speak carefully, and never linger too long in his presence. Henry had become a king who ruled not through love or admiration, but through fear. Those who once praised his charisma now whispered of his cruelty. Despite his physical decline, Henry still demanded the image of grandeur. He wrapped himself in jewel-encrusted robes, wore enormous fur-lined coats, and appeared at court as though nothing had changed. He built forts along the coast and expanded England's navy, determined to project strength even as his body weakened. For Henry, appearances mattered. He wanted the world to remember him as a mighty king, not a feeble old man. The more fragile he became, the more he hid behind ceremony and splendor. His health, however, was impossible to ignore. Henry was dangerously overweight, likely weighing over 300 pounds. He suffered from diabetes, heart problems, and his infected ulcers oozed constantly. Walking unaided was nearly impossible. His physicians tried ointments, bandages, and endless remedies, but nothing truly helped. Pain made him irritable, and his temper grew worse. The once vibrant king was trapped in a body that could no longer match his towering ambition. Yet even in decline, Henry's appetite for control remained fierce. He still schemed over European politics, still dreamed of glory, and still played the role of God's chosen king. He gave orders for campaigns in France, demanded fortifications across England, and signed off on executions without hesitation. The king who once broke with Rome for love was now breaking men for power. His reign had begun with charm, but it was ending with blood. As death drew closer, Henry began to worry about his legacy. He had fought so hard for a son, and now young Edward was the future of the dynasty. But Edward was frail, often sickly, and still a child. Would he survive to rule? Henry could only hope. He restored both Mary and Elizabeth to the line of succession, a move that revealed his pragmatism. The Tudor dynasty, once so precarious, would rest on all three of his children. In his final years, Henry looked at them not as pawns but as the fragile thread tying his legacy together. Henry's last queen, Catherine Parr, stood faithfully by his side. She tended to him, soothed his rages, and gave him comfort in his final years. Without her, his decline might have been even harsher. Catherine read to him, debated with him, and even helped manage his affairs when his health left him bedridden. She was his nurse, his companion, and in many ways his last defense against total despair. By January 1547, Henry knew the end was near. He was 55 years old, but his body was worn out far beyond his years. His physicians could do little but ease his pain. Courtiers whispered about who would rule once he was gone, while Henry himself clung stubbornly to life. He never admitted weakness, never said aloud that death was close, but his once booming voice had grown faint, and the mighty King of England was fading. On January 28, 1547, Henry VIII died at Whitehall Palace. The man who had ruled England for nearly 4 decades, the king with 6 wives, the king who had broken with Rome, the king who had changed the very course of history was gone. His body was placed in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, beside Jane Seymour, the wife he had called his true queen. He left behind a kingdom transformed, richer in power, but scarred by blood. Henry's final days tell a story of contrasts. He began as a golden prince, beloved and admired, and ended as a bloated tyrant, feared and cursed. Yet his legacy endured. He fathered Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth, 3 monarchs whose reigns would shape the destiny of England. His break with Rome had reshaped religion forever. His hunger for control, love and glory left scars still studied today. In the quiet halls of Windsor, where his tomb lies, the echoes of his life remain, a man of charm and cruelty, passion and paranoia, vision and vanity. Henry VIII, larger than life even in death. Henry VIII is remembered as much for his wives as for his own reign. 6 women, 6 very different stories, each one caught in the storm of Henry's ambition. Their fates became a rhyme passed down through history. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But behind that sing-song memory are real women, with real hopes and tragedies. Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr. Together they tell the tale of a dynasty built on love, power, and loss. Catherine of Aragon was Henry's first queen. She was strong, proud, and deeply religious. Married to Henry for over 20 years, she was cast aside when she failed to give him a surviving son. Her fate was a quiet tragedy. Sent away from court, she lived her final years in lonely exile, her health failing. Yet she never stopped calling herself Henry's true wife, nor did she ever stop loving him. In her eyes, she died a queen, even if Henry declared otherwise. Anne Boleyn's fate was more dramatic. She had risen like a comet, captivating Henry, reshaping England and giving birth to Elizabeth. But her boldness and failure to produce a son sealed her doom. Arrested on false charges, she faced trial and execution at the Tower of London. On the scaffold, she showed grace and courage, refusing to curse Henry. History remembers her not just as a victim, but as a queen whose short reign changed the course of England forever. Jane Seymour's fate was bittersweet. She was the quiet, obedient wife who gave Henry his longed-for son, Edward. For this, Henry called her his true queen. but Jane paid with her life. Just 12 days after Edward's birth, she died of complications from childbirth. Henry was devastated, more than he ever admitted with any other wife. When he died, he chose to be buried beside her. In Henry's mind, Jane was the one who had given him everything. Anne of Cleves, the political bride, was luckier than most. Married to Henry for only a few months, their union was annulled quickly. But Anne accepted her fate with grace. Instead of being cast aside in disgrace, she was given a generous settlement and the title of the king's beloved sister. She lived comfortably in England, respected and free from the dangers that haunted the others. Out of all Henry's wives, Anne had the rare fortune to walk away with her head held high and still attached to her shoulders. Catherine Howard's story was the most tragic of all. Barely 19 when she married Henry, she was young, lively and full of charm. But her past romances and her reckless closeness with Thomas Culpeper sealed her doom. Henry felt betrayed and humiliated, and Catherine was arrested for adultery. At the Tower she wept and begged for mercy, but there was none. She was executed in 1542, still a teenager, remembered as a rose that bloomed too early and was cut too soon. Catherine Parr, the final wife, earned the title of the survivor. Twice widowed before Henry, she was wise, kind and deeply religious. She managed to nurse the king in his final years, reconcile his children, and even publish books under her own name. She came close to arrest when enemies accused her of heresy, but she talked her way out of danger. After Henry's death, she remarried for love, though she died young from childbirth complications. Yet she remains the only wife who truly outlasted Henry's storm. Together, the 6 wives reveal a pattern. None of them truly chose Henry. Each was caught in the trap of politics, power, or survival. Some loved him, some feared him, some endured him. And while Henry's reign was filled with blood and ambition, their stories give us glimpses of humanity, courage, devotion, and resilience in the face of impossible odds. Their fates shaped not just Henry's life, but the very future of England. Rhyme divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, oversimplifies their lives. Catherine of Aragon was more than a divorce. Anne Boleyn was more than a beheading. Jane Seymour was more than her death in childbirth. Anne of Cleves was more than a political pawn. Catherine Howard was more than her teenage mistakes. Catherine Parr was more than a survivor. They were queens, mothers, thinkers and individuals whose legacies echo through history. So when we look back on Henry VIII, we cannot separate him from the women who stood beside him. Their fates were tied to his, sometimes in love, sometimes in fear, always in history. Some died, some endured, one survived, but all left their mark. In the end, it wasn't just Henry who shaped England, it was Catherine, Anne, Jane, Anne, Catherine, and Catherine. 6 women, 6 stories, forever bound to one king's name, but never forgotten in their own right. When Henry VIII died in 1547, he left behind a kingdom transformed. The young golden prince who had once charmed Europe had become a bloated tyrant feared by his own people. Yet his reign was one of the most consequential in English history. He had broken England from the Pope in Rome, founded the Church of England, and reshaped religion forever. He had changed how monarchs ruled, asserting power that reached into every corner of his realm. Henry was a man of contradictions, charming and cruel, visionary and paranoid, passionate and ruthless. His legacy is as complicated as his life. The most lasting impact of Henry's reign was his break with Rome. When the Pope refused to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry took matters into his own hands. He declared himself head of the Church of England, seizing power that no English king had ever held before. This act tore England away from centuries of Catholic authority and set the stage for centuries of religious upheaval. The Reformation in England was not just about theology, it was about Henry's will. Yet by breaking with Rome, he set England on a path that would shape its future as a Protestant nation. Henry also reshaped the map of England itself. By dissolving monasteries, he stripped the Catholic Church of wealth and power, seizing lands and treasures for the crown. Monks and nuns were turned out of their cloisters, and England's landscape changed forever. Abbeys that had stood for centuries crumbled into ruins, but the crown grew richer, and loyal nobles grew stronger as they received lands once held by the Church. The echoes of this destruction can still be seen today in the haunting ruins scattered across the English countryside. Politically, Henry left behind a stronger monarchy. He centralized authority in ways that made the king the ultimate power in England. Parliament was used more often, yes, but it was still Henry who bent it to his will. He executed nobles, destroyed rivals, and reshaped the court to reflect his dominance. The message was clear. In Henry's England, the crown ruled above all else. Later monarchs would inherit not just his throne, but the stronger foundations he had built. But Henry's legacy wasn't just about power, it was about his children. Against all odds, all 3 of his legitimate children would sit on the throne. Edward VI, the fragile boy Henry adored, ruled briefly but left no heir. Mary I, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, became the first queen to rule in her own right, determined to restore Catholicism, and Elizabeth I, Anne Boleyn's daughter, became one of the greatest monarchs in English history, ushering in the Elizabethan age. In a strange twist of fate, the daughters Henry had once dismissed as illegitimate carried on his dynasty more lastingly than his precious son. Henry's reign also changed England's place in the world. His wars with France and Scotland drained resources, but his investment in ships laid the groundwork for England's future as a naval power. Though he never saw it, the fleets he built were the ancestors of the navy that would one day defend England against the Spanish Armada. Henry's desire to look powerful on the world stage planted seeds that would grow long after his death. For the common people, Henry's reign was a mix of fear and change. Taxes were heavy, executions were frequent, and rebellions simmered more than once. Yet he also gave the monarchy a new sense of identity. His face, broad and commanding, became one of the most iconic images in English history. Painters like Hans Holbein immortalized him not as a fragile old man, but as a king larger than life. To this day, when people imagine a king, they often picture Henry VIII, bearded, broad-shouldered, hand on hip, staring you down with unshakable authority. Yet his legacy is haunted by blood, 2 wives beheaded, countless nobles executed, friends betrayed, all part of Henry's story. He built greatness, but at the cost of lives and loyalty. His reign reminds us of the thin line between power and tyranny. Henry's ambition gave England strength, but it also scarred the land with fear. His legacy is not one of simple glory, it is one of contradiction, where greatness and cruelty walked hand in hand. Perhaps the greatest irony of Henry's legacy lies in his obsession with sons. He changed religion, discarded wives, and spilled blood to secure a male heir. Yet it was not Edward who defined the Tudor dynasty. It was Elizabeth. The daughter he once dismissed as illegitimate became one of the greatest rulers in English history, remembered as Gloriana, the Virgin Queen. Henry had spent his life chasing the future through sons, but it was his daughter who carried his name into legend. So what is Henry VIII's legacy? He was not the greatest warrior, nor the wisest ruler, nor the kindest husband, but he was unforgettable. He left behind a kingdom stronger, a church transformed, and a dynasty that would change the world. He was a man of passion, contradictions, and iron will. To this day, his story captures the imagination, because it shows both the heights and the horrors of power. Henry VIII's reign was not just history, it was legend, and legends, like kings, never truly die.